whereof what's past is prologue, what to come in yours and my discharge, spake Antonio to Sebastian in William Shakespeare's The Tempest, an often forgotten play amongst those produced by the Bard, one of his earliest, whose players performed at the Royal Globe Theatre along the Strand. Just like most who think of any black roles in a Shakespeare play being limited to the part of the tragic Othello, who loved his fairest Desdemona well, but not wisely, defeated by his satanic antagonist Iago, who knew well that the devil had the power to assume a pleasing form. But The Tempest actually finds its tropical setting on the island of Bermuda, often called the Lie of Devils, and the topmost point of the Devil's Triangle, where ships disappear, they say, and where some suggest that Shakespeare found his inspiration for this out-of-Europe tale after accounts of a voyage bound for Jamestown, Virginia, was shipwrecked during a violent storm. But whereof what's past is prologue. Hello, my name is Major Mike Webb, and after what has been described as a historic moment, as Joe Biden, the president, added the 12th federal holiday to our calendar, and the most recent since the observation of the birthday of Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., many are reveling in celebration to mark the festive occasion, but for the next few moments, we shall attempt to provide a broader context for this day in history that shall now be observed in perpetuity, posing the question as to whether it is history at all. Whereof what's past is prologue, what to come in yours and my discharge. Most commentators and politicians have described Juneteenth as the day that slavery was abolished, and we shall get back to that point in a moment, because one forgotten figure who is actually a very prominent part of this historic event has not received any press at all. And believe it or not, just like one might expect, the father of the commanding general for the Confederate forces in Galveston, Texas, had a father who had owned slaves. But what you may not know is that Brigadier General Stand Watie began life with the name Degataga, the son of Watie, a member of the Cherokee Nation, most remembered for the Trail of Tears that marched from Georgia in 1838, after the passage of the Indian Removal Act in 1830, an attempt to remove them, the native peoples, to make way for gold prospectors who were bound for Georgia. But that event changed the life of the anglicized Degataga. But even in future observances of Juneteenth, probably no one will ever recall his part in a new national holiday. So let's just tell his story here. Whereof what's past is prologue, what to come in yours and my discharge. Degataga's father, too, was a Cherokee, but also a wealthy landholder in Georgia and planter with many slaves. He had been anglicized as a Christian and joined the Moravian Church, changing his native name of Uwaiti to David Uwaiti, and his son Degataga's name to Isaac S. Uwaiti. As an anglicized Cherokee, Isaac Uwaiti attended a Moravian mission school, where he learned to speak English so well that he later helped his brother as an adult to publish the Cherokee Phoenix, a tribal newspaper. And by the time Isaac reached young adulthood, his father, David Uwaiti, had become a very wealthy planter who owned many African-American slaves. But Isaac decided to do what probably most would do after the passage of the Indian Removal Act. He decided to do what he was told by the government, accept the free money, and go west, young man. And in 1837, just before things got bad, he had set out to take up a new life in Honey Creek, Iowa in the Midwest. And just 1 year later, a quarter of the 12,000 members of his tribe and nation who were forced to march were lost on the journey west to their relocation settlements, probably under the belief originally that it was not about their rights. And somewhere around that time, Isaac became radicalized and changed his name to Stand Wait. And when the war broke out between the Union and the Confederacy, he found the opportunity for which he had been waiting for decades and began to organize the first Indian regiment among fellow Cherokee, Seminole, Creek, and Osage warriors to aid in what today, by many, is called the Lost Cause. And his regiment distinguished itself under his command, especially during the battles through Arkansas, the Battle of Pea Ridge in March 1862, where his braves even captured the Union battery during a failed effort by the Confederate Army that found only defeat. 2 years later, his braves were credited with the major victory, capturing the Union steamboat, the J.R. Williams. And months after that, even seizing $2 million, almost $2 million in supplies from a Union wagon supply train at Cabin Creek. General Stanway's Cherokee Mounted Rifles Regiment worked to secure the Indian territories for the Confederate Army and continued throughout the war to recruit other Native American braves to assist in an effort to go against the Union, who was their mortal enemy and who had forced his people from their homes when they refused to be enticed by a fat government check. But few connect that trail of tears with the celebration of Juneteenth, when the news of the Emancipation Proclamation that was published in January 1863 was finally brought to the slaves in Galveston, Texas in June 1865, who were wholly ignorant of the fact that the president had emancipated the slaves in the rebelling states like Texas. And you have to wonder how anyone might be so misinformed so as not to hear any news at all about an entire civil war that had been raging for 5 long years. But perhaps they were simply doing what they were told. Whereof what's past is prologue, what to come in yours and my discharge. Well, Brigadier General Stanway did not see it coming for his people either in 1837 when he decided to accept the government payout and just do what he was told. And he was still very agitated decades later, so agitated that he decided to become not just a community organizer, but a military regiment organizer and recruiter. And months after every Confederate regiment had surrendered to the Union Army, Brigadier General Stand Watie, whose name means stand firm, continued to keep up the fight until his surrender on June 23rd, 1865, 4 days after the Juneteenth that has become the newest federal holiday. Whereof what's past is prologue, but to come in yours and my discharge. But another bit of African American history forgotten on Juneteenth is that the Emancipation Proclamation only applied to the states in rebellion. And border states like West Virginia that had seceded from Virginia remained slave states. West Virginia had seceded from Virginia to avoid invasion and remained a slave state for 2 years after that proclamation, while other border states like Maryland that fought with the Union were not forced to emancipate their slaves until 3/4 of the states had ratified the 13th Amendment, the legal document for its adoption, not on June 19th, but December 18th, 1865. But perhaps just as important is the story of Brigadier General Stand Watie, born with the name Degataga, and later through assimilation in mission schools had learned to speak English, had changed his name to Isaac. The very first African-American military officer in the United States Army was Lieutenant Henry Ossian Clipper. And after surviving an attempt to remove him from the United States Military Academy at West Point for an honor violation, he did not graduate until 1877, 16 years after Stand Watie had served as a flag officer and regimental commander in the Army of the Confederacy. And as a lieutenant, Henry O. Clipper's military career came to an abrupt and tragic end after he received a general court-martial, falsely accused by his commander, Colonel William Rufus Shafter, of embezzling funds. Today, on the annex, where the state legislature meets in what is called the former capital of the Confederacy, Pocahontas, the name of Lady Rebecca Rolfe, is on the side of a building, giving her her childhood nickname to be remembered forever, and not the royal title that she had earned as an adult. And perhaps it is always good to have a power to change someone's history. Or why else would we now have a new holiday, whereof what's past is prologue, what to come in yours and my discharge. This briefing is unclassified, as you were. My name is Major Mike Webb, and by God, I am running for Arlington Public School Board. Let's keep Mike Webb away from our school. Honest. Carry on. This advertisement was authorized by Mike Webb.
Far too little, far too late. I think that the service had to be effective within a year. I find that